Hello everyone, morning and welcome to my channel where I give you updates on environmental issues, easy to understand updates on environmental issues, and also leadership tips that will help position you as a change maker, a true change maker. And today I'll be touching on something that is both scary and I don't know what other word to use in describing it, but it's definitely scary. And it's about this little tiny pesky annoying things called microplastics. Now, I know it will be news to you that microplastics have been found almost everywhere. Found microplastics in breast milk, found microplastics in human blood, in placentas, drinking water, everywhere. Just to make it easy, let's just say everywhere we found microplastics. But who would have thought that microplastics would go as far? In my opinion, they've simply crossed the red line. And so, a research that was published about, I think last week, this research, very recent research, has found microplastics in human and dog testicles. Yeah, you heard me right. Testicles. Testicles, the most private part of men, That's where they finally found microplastics, and how they found their way to that place. Yeah, a lot of science can explain that. But let's stay away from the science and just talk about what exactly has these researchers found. How did they go about the research? What they did, and I'm sure some people were wondering now, did they just run around chopping off people's balls and looking into the balls for plastics? No, that's not what they did. They got testicles from cadavers, dead bodies, and for humans, they got 23 testicles. For dogs, they got about 47 testicles. And what they did was to break down the tissue, found a way to break down the tissue and then analyze the remnants for microplastics. And they used very, very sensitive and accurate methods to analyze those remnants for microplastics. And what they found was 12 different types of microplastics in this testicle, this tissue that was analyzed. And they found some very, very interesting things. The first thing they found that in my opinion is interesting is that, so if we consider the weight of the microplastics that was found in the 47 dog testicle samples that was analyzed, it would be equivalent to a grain of rice per gram of the testicular tissue. So they took the testicles, break it down, and in a gram of that tissue, they found approximately the weight of a grain of rice. But for the humans, they found approximately 3 grains of rice. Now, for me, that's a bit alarming because dogs normally don't mind eating from the ground, but we oftentimes do not go about eating from the ground. Yet, they found more microplastics in human testicles than in dog testicles. For me, that's alarming, number one. Number two, something else they found, which I find interesting, is that there was the concentration of microplastics in testicles obtained from people within the age of 22 and 45. That's the sexually active age, was higher than the microplastics that was found in the testicles that was collected from people in the ages between 55 to 80 downwards. And what that means is, in that age where people are sexually active, there's more microplastics in the testicles. Now, possible explanations that the researchers provided were, one, it could be that the body has a way of getting rid of this microplastic. So with time, it could be that the microplastics were eliminated from the body by some mechanisms. Another possible explanation could be that because the energy demand of the testicles at that very sexually active age is more, it could be that these microplastics are pulled in higher number. So these are possible explanations. Another interesting finding is that the most commonly used microplastics were the predominant microplastics that were found. So polyvinyl chloride, PVC, was the second most abundant in the samples that were analyzed. The highest and the most abundant that was found is polyethylene, PE. Now, this is microplastic we use for food packaging. Almost everything that we use plastics for is made of PE. And there's the most represented microplastics in that sample, or in the samples that were analyzed. What this means is that these microplastics clearly come in not through any other means, but by use of these plastics. But the implication of this finding, if you may, because oftentimes when we talk about microplastics, people say, and so what? We found microplastics in drinking water, we found it everywhere. So what? Now, to answer the so what, there's another very interesting trend that has been observed. There's been a gradual decline in sperm counts in men across the world. In places like America, there's been an about 50% decline in sperm counts over 50 years. Now, that previously has been attributed to other pollutants like pesticides and other things. But with this discovery, could it be that microplastics are also culprits in this issue? And that's very likely, because one thing we know about plastics is because a lot of chemicals are added during manufacture of these plastics, these chemicals have the ability to leach out of the plastics and cause serious harms. I'm talking about chemicals that we know are harmful to the human body. So these are implications that would make you start thinking and start wondering where we're going with this. Another very interesting trend that would make us wonder where we're going with this is, we know currently that the rate of exposure to plastics is doubling every 10 to 15 years. And to put that in perspective, it means that if currently of the 8 billion people on this planet, if 3 billion people are walking around with testicles full of microplastics, it means that if that number would double in the next 10 to 15 years. Or if we want to look at the number or the size, the quantity of the microplastics itself. So if we have 3 billion people, say, moving around with, say, 3 grains of rice worth weight of microplastics in their testicles today, it means in 10 to 15 years, we would have the same people walking around with 6 grains of rice worth of microplastics in the testicles. So you multiply 30, 60 years, we would have a scenario where people will have scrotums full of microplastics instead of testicles. That's where this is going. And although I make it sound a bit funny and I laugh about it, but this is a serious problem. And then that brings us to the very, very important question of, what can I do? What can we do to help this situation? Now, I must confess at this point that the bigger responsibility, the stronger, the greater responsibility lies with governments and big companies. I mean, a couple of days ago I was looking at, because if you buy things from the stores and most of these things that are packaged with plastics, you would see on some of them it's clearly written that recycle in superstores. And so what I do is I separate these plastics and I try to recycle them in the stores. And what I have found over time is that I tend to gather loads of these things in a week. Just about a week, you see, I've gathered so many of them. So I believe strongly that one thing that needs to be done is for companies, organizations, governments to reduce the use of these plastics. But on our end, so what can we do? Number one, there are a couple of tips that I'm going to provide. But the most obvious of these tips is that we should try as much as we can to reduce the use of plastics. I would be lying if I sit down here and tell you that it's possible for us to stop using plastics completely. That's not possible now. I'm recording with a camera that is mostly plastic. I've written this morning with a pen that is mostly plastic. My computer is largely plastic. My phone, plastic. A lot of things plastic around us. So we've not arrived at that point where we can avoid plastics completely. But what we can do is to reduce where we can the use of plastics. But that's a very general, a very broad, tip. Now, let's come down to some things that you may not have heard before. Number one is, if you can, do not microwave your food or anything you're going to eat in plastic containers. The same goes with using dishwashers to wash plastic containers. And the reason is simply because these pollutants or these chemicals in these plastics that can harm us oftentimes are released faster in higher temperature. So if you put your food in a plastic container and microwave it, what happens is at that higher temperature, these organic pollutants can tend to come out more, and that would have more effect on your body. Number two important tip that you may not have heard of before is, every plastic you see has a recycling number on it. So if you look, oftentimes it's just at the bottom. So if I take this for example, now if you look at this plastic, you would see there's a number 05 somewhere there. I don't know if it's visible, if you can see it. So there's 05 there, and underneath the 05 you see PP on it. Now that number is the recycling code, and it gives us an idea of the kind of plastic we're dealing with. So for this one, it says PP, that's polypropylene. Now polypropylene, fine, but some experts have said if you can, you should avoid things with recycling code of 3, recycling codes of 6, and recycling codes of 7. But if you can only avoid one, then recycle and avoid recycling codes of 3. So what I'm saying basically is try as much as you can, if you must use plastics, to restrict yourself to recycling codes of 2, 4, and 5. For 3, most plastic containers that carry that recycling code of 3 are made of PVC, polyvinyl chloride. And because PVC is usually hard, it's usually softened using a chemical called phthalates that can easily cause harm to us. Hopefully I'll do another video where I'll break down and I'll talk more about these recycling codes and what they mean. But for now, these are some of the things we can start doing to help ourselves and to keep, to play our part in trying to solve this problem. So thank you for taking your time to watch. Hopefully with these little tips and these activities, you'll be able to reduce the number of plastics or microplastics in your testicles. I don't think you want to go around carrying a testicle full of plastic. So for now, thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll catch up very soon. Cheers.